Okay, I think that we will get started then. As I said, here we are entering the final online session for today, and just for 1 hour. And I can really guarantee for this, it's a session worth hanging in for. As we heard in the previous session, I mean, you cannot separate talking about the context for child and youth mental health promotion, cannot separate that from the pandemic times that we are in. Clearly having a profound aspect or a profound impact on all things child and youth mental health promotion and many other things as well. This session explores the influence of the pandemic context, and it's in response to some preliminary findings from a hub-led study on the pandemic experiences of the Mental Health Promotion Innovation Fund projects. And that was outlined as preparation for this session to review the handout, 3.5 pages, that highlighted 9 main themes. Those were shown in the pre-session slides as well. And perhaps we can put, just for those who maybe were unable to take a look at that handout, perhaps if we can put that link into the chat, that would be terrific as well, just as we open the session. So with 1 hour, I think one of the themes for the overall symposium, I mean, movement has come up in many different ways. Another is sort of tip of the iceberg. And don't worry, I'm not mixing up the sessions and going back to the Jamboard, but tip of the iceberg in the sense that I think we'll be able to start this conversation on the influence of the pandemic, and not only that, but the pandemic is evolving. So the conversation about its impact, past, present, and future, is also evolving. So in this 1 hour session, we have 4 panelists, another set of 4. I have to say, amazing. I sound a bit like a broken record, but really, these are. I really do mean this. I mean, they're amazing individually, and there's a real magic in the mix too. I do once again invite you to refer to sort of full bios that are in the list of attendees. And what I'm going to do is, I mean, the first round with this panel is going to be to invite each of them to share the perspective they are bringing to this conversation. So I won't steal sort of their thunder or duplicate what they're going to say, hopefully, but by way of introduction and as a segue to that opening round, I would like to just say a very warm welcome and thank you to each of you for being part of this session. Josh Fullen, when meeting him for the first time, by extending a speaker invitation for the symposium, I was so impressed with his very strong, what I picked up anyway, a very strong mission reference and doing highly relevant work that's related to the pandemic, to mental health, and to children and youth. So Josh, we're delighted that you chose to join us here. Claire Betker, you've seen and heard a little bit from Claire Betker, and we're so delighted, Claire. I mean, panelist extraordinaire, clearly. She's on 2 today, but also, oh my gosh, as I was pausing during the break, I thought, plus a facilitator, plus a resource person. We're working you hard, Claire, thank you. And I would say ditto on her clarity of purpose, and absolutely in relation to determinants of health generally and determinants of mental health. Vanessa Amptman-Smith, another first meeting because of this event, and I have to say I'm truly delighted about that. And in a single conversation with Vanessa, I truly was blown away by, once again, her clarity of purpose and her very thoughtful and humble awareness of her roles and her strengths. So Vanessa, we're so delighted that you're able to join us. And our 4th panelist, Kathy Short, I keep saying ditto, 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 ditto on all the complementary descriptors and more. I mean, thoughtful, passionate, self-aware, leader, blah, blah, blah. Plus, fun fact, Kathy and I have been friends since grade 9. Yes, that's very cool. So in the same order as my introductions here, this first quick round will establish the primary perspective each of you brings to the discussion today. We'll just do a quick round, the 1 or 2 minutes, and we'll move through in that order. So Josh, Claire, Vanessa, and Kathy, and I won't interrupt each of you. Let's just flow through that lineup and each of you offering your perspective. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Barb, and really happy to be part of this conversation, which is incredibly high stakes, and I think just gets more and more urgent with each passing day of the pandemic. I have been working with a small research team at Maximum City since April 2020 on the impacts of COVID on children and youth. And we really looked at 3 kind of buckets of things. School experience was one, subjective well-being, and then healthy movement behaviors. And if I can sort of summarize, 10 months of research or distill it into a couple of sentences, I'll tell you this, is that the data, true to form with the virus, the data tells us that the impacts of COVID are different on different kids and different groups of kids. Some kids are adapting well to COVID conditions. Some are even thriving, finding ways to thrive. Others are really struggling. And I think what it's about for us, at least, and many others pulling on the same oar, it's about getting to a deeper understanding of the factors that contribute to those uneven impacts in order to calibrate, adjust, and sustainable response. And then I think the perspective that I can bring to this conversation today is really about honoring child voice and their lived experience. So we've been engaged in kind of a national listening exercise for the last 10 months with a few thousand kids and teenagers really listening deeply to what they're going through during the pandemic.
Sorry, I should be ready. Barb said she wasn't going to help with the baton handing. Thank you, Josh. As Barb said, I'm Claire Betker. I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I'm a registered nurse. And I began my career in rural Manitoba in a one-nurse public health office in southwestern Manitoba. So what's going on in the pandemic, resonates with me not only as a wife and a mother and a grandmother and a citizen and community member, but also as a practitioner and a professional for more than 40 years. So it's the most serious thing we've faced as a public health system for a very, very long time, 100 years probably. So the National Collaborating Center for Determinative Health is one of 6 collaborating centers across the country. And you met Olivier Bellefleur from the National Collaborating Center for Healthy Public Policy this morning in the first panel. And they look at healthy public policy. But there's also one in Winnipeg, the National Collaborating Center for Infectious Diseases, and they're very, very busy right now in the work around COVID-19 and the pandemic, and around vaccines and vaccine confidence and those kinds of things. I'd encourage you to check out that website. One in British Columbia that's focused on environmental health. And again, there are some really interesting environmental health perspectives within the pandemic, waste testing and those kinds of things. If you're interested, check out that website. A beautiful website with an organization hosted by the University of Northern BC, the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health. They believe and they look at their audience as being Indigenous people and Indigenous communities, some very, very solid and very good, and a lot of it resourced there. So if you're looking for pandemic related or COVID-19 related material, go there as well from an Indigenous perspective, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. And then finally, there's a National Collaborating Center for Methods and Tools that's hosted by McMaster University, and they do a lot of systematic reviews. So again, around COVID-19, a lot of good material on their website, and they're open to answering questions from a systematic review or knowledge synthesis perspective. So we all were created, and we've been around for more than 15 years now, in the wake of SARS. And were conceived with the Chief Public Health Officer, Theresa Tam. You all know her, a set of chief public health officers across the country, and you've seen many of them on the media and in different venues. And then us, this set of centers that was envisioned, mission, to get that evidence as it emerges and all the multiple types of evidence in the hands of decision makers. And we've been given some additional funding, small, each of us, to really focus on COVID. So you'll find COVID on all of our different websites. But the perspective I bring today is our work in looking at the social and structural determinants of health, and in particular, really trying to focus on the equity and inequities that exist, that we already knew, and have just seen made manifest in and during this pandemic, and really to look at what can we do. So I think that's the perspective that I can bring this afternoon. Thanks.
Ani Bojo Nishu Banasik Indishnakas Benistodam. Hello, everyone. My name is Vanessa Antman-Smith, and I come to you today from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenni Lenape, and Attawataran at the fork of the Deshkonzibing, or Thames River, located in present-day London, Ontario. And I just want to say it's with great humility. I'm holding that stone just to ground me and remind me that, you know, I'm coming from a place of knowing, as an Indigenous scholar, an Indigenous woman, a mother, a former Indigenous health system planner, and a current Indigenous health advocate. And where I see myself and locate myself in this work today is as a current scholar and one of 10 co-authors of the December 2020 Royal Society of Canada report on COVID-19 and Indigenous health and wellness. So Claire, add that to your list. The Royal Society of Canada has their task force on COVID-19, and from that work, there are a number of reports, including the one that I participated in. So it's an honor to be here, Miigwech, and I look forward to chatting with you today.
And hello, I'm Kathy Short. I live and work on land that is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes, so currently Hamilton region. Thank you for inviting me. Everyone has a COVID story, and each story is unique. Yours is, mine is, as is the story of every child, youth, family, and community that we serve. So I'm going to tell you something about the organizational journey and learning within the area of school mental health in Ontario. And I'd invite you to think about your project and your organizational narrative through COVID-19. And you can think about where my comments might resonate and where they might not. I know many of the projects are outside of schools. They're in communities and working alongside schools, and a few are in. But as Dr. Barry noted, context is really critical when it comes to mental health promotion, and I can only share the context I know. So you know yours, and you'll be able to pull out. And my phone's ringing, by the way, so I'm hoping that isn't distracting to anyone except me. So School Mental Health Ontario is a provincial team that works together with Ontario school boards to support student mental health. And we do this in partnership with board mental health leadership teams. So every school board in Ontario has a mental health leader who is a clinician, and a superintendent who's an educator who has responsibility for overseeing a mental health team. And their job is to create a school mental health strategy and action plan. And so those plans are actually based on multi-tiered systems of support, as Dr. Barry noted in her keynote address. So dealing with universal mental health promotion, targeted prevention, and intervention services as well, so all tiers. And it's offered as a system of care across sectors. So together with our partners in school districts, there are 72 school districts and 4 remote school authorities. We set clear directions for school mental health, And then we provide resources and implementation coaching to help boards to align this with their own local needs, resources, and priorities. So I'll just note that every board in the province has an implementation coach, and they support mental health programming across the tiers. So I think the last thing to note is that what we're really trying to do as a kind of intermediary between research, policy, and practice is to ensure that no matter where students attend school in the province, that they have access to the same evidence-based strategies and supports in ways that are locally and culturally responsive. And importantly, can be sustained over time, not sort of one-off sorts of things that come and go. So our focus isn't just on what, but also how. And we try to create supportive conditions and add that to evidence-informed practice and then ongoing implementation support. So I guess I'll be bringing this sort of school-based implementation science approach to our conversation this afternoon. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks to all of you. I think that I do think that that sort of sharing, and very thoughtful from all of you, that sharing of what your perspective is really important to help ground us in you know, what's to come in terms of your response to, your reflections on the themes that were identified in the hub-led study. I do want to reinforce, Kathy, what you shared is all each of us can bring is our own perspective, our own experience, etc. And so that's all that anyone has been been invited to do, is asked to do, and we really do appreciate the mix of perspectives that are being brought together here in this conversation. Round two, and we'll do it in the same order. All of you, as you know, have been asked to consider what resonated and why from the themes identified in the hub-led study. Lift out one or more of the themes and please discuss them in relation to the perspective that that you shared. So we'll do that once again in the same order. So Josh.
Thank you, Barb. It's very hard not to start with number 8, amplifying inequities and reinforcing mental health determinants. I mean, that is really the COVID story, and it's Can folks still hear me?
Yep. Sounds
Okay.
like you're back.
You're back now, Josh.
I am going to turn my video off if that's okay, because I've got a bit of an unstable connection. And I'll just start again by saying that it's hard not to begin with the 8th theme, which is amplifying inequities and reinforcing determinants of mental health. That is really the COVID story, particularly in cities, which is the context we look at closely at our organization. But I just would I think it's important to add some of the groups that are getting hit harder based on our findings. So if you look at kids who live in apartments, so in vertical communities, they are showing worse healthy behavior outcomes. Kids who don't have access to outdoor space, to shared outdoor space, or to quality indoor space, also showing worse outcomes and healthy behaviors. Kids who go to school online, exclusively online, which is a lot of kids right now in Southern Ontario at least, also showing worse outcomes, and kids in large urban centers. So those are all sort of conditions that I think we need to reflect on as a society and as a culture in terms of what we can do as a response. And it really comes down to an urban planning response, I think, to meet those needs of the groups who are getting hit hardest by the restrictions. And I will say this, there are modifiable behaviors that we're seeing are associated with better well-being outcomes. So things like physical activity, interaction with a friend, social interaction, even through a screen, and time outdoors, those 3 are modifiable behaviors that are associated with better outcomes. So I think I'll just sort of leave it at that theme number 8, amplifying inequities, really is strongly represented in our data. And it also, if you go into those subgroups, the kids who live in apartments, the kids who don't have access to outdoor space, the inequities are amplified yet again.
Thank you, Josh. And those, the reports, I mean, it's a fascinating multi-phase study and so relevant and truly late breaking, analyses and results that have been published. So we have made those resources available, and thank you for highlighting that theme, Josh. Claire.
Thank you, Barb, and thanks, Josh, for that. And I'm going to look at number 8, amplifying inequities and reinforcing the importance of mental health determinants, but also social and structural determinants of health. And early on, actually, for 5 Wednesdays in April of 2020, we held 5 about an hour and a half long webinars. And we had, I think, 13 or 14 different speakers, leaders, community leaders, elders, practitioners, community members to those webinars. And we were really exploring then what was the emerging and have since been made manifest some of the things in terms of social determinants of health and the pandemic as it was just beginning and people were planning and some of those measures were being put in place. And I want to share the 4 themes, and I just want to speak to the third one for a moment because it really resonates with what we've heard over the day. So the 4 broad themes, we did a content analysis and looked at the questions, the comments, the participants, all that was said during those conversations. So first of all is oppressive, unjust systems and existing health and social inequities. I mean, we have colonized systems, we have systems that health and social systems in our country that are oppressive and are unjust. And that health and social systems at the same time were also under duress and actually in many ways, and I'll speak to public health, were non-responsive to equity, even though we consider it a core value, something that we stand on. We tended in that emergency situation to actually push aside some of that equity lens, if you will, or those equity questions. Third, already in April, we were seeing disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 that were driven by underlying structural and socioeconomic inequities that already existed. And I think that has only continued and actually amplified over the months that have passed since then. But the fourth one, and this is where there's some hope, is there was also enhanced momentum for collective mobilization movements, as you said earlier, Barb, policy innovations, and actually social transformation. So one person said that we really needed to go back to better. And this was April. That's before Build Back Better. This particular participant talked about that goal of going back to better, going back to something very different and fundamentally shifted. So in that number 3, the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19, and this is April, and I'll just read the different categories that came out of that. Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. Whether those people lived on First Nations or whether they were actually, where I live in Winnipeg, in downtown urban centers. That there was, jurisdictional conflicts, inadequate housing, lack of access to clean water, many, many things. So topped our list was, in what we heard, was Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. But also Black and racialized communities. That systemic racism was made manifest in those inequities that we saw unfolding in April. Gender, that women and gender diverse people actually experienced increased exposure to COVID-19 because they were overrepresented in the health, social, and service sector jobs that were deemed as essential, and from a nursing perspective, as nothing more manifest than what occurred within the long-term care sector. Others that were really at risk were those that were precariously employed and became more precariously employed or unemployed. Many talked about food, being food insecure, being housing insecure, and that housing inadequacy was actually worsened as shelters closed and community organizations closed in response to the public health measures that were put in place and remain in place. People with disabilities, it was a very interesting session where we had someone speaking to people with disabilities and the stigma and discrimination that they would experience in pre-COVID times was just exacerbated, and they anticipated it being more exacerbated during COVID. And then finally, and the topic that sort of covers it all, was that COVID-19 significantly impacted the mental health of practitioners, of essential workers, of community members, including trauma, stress, anxiety, worry, and all of those folks are parts of families and communities and also affect children and youth. So those were sort of our findings early in April, and we've got lots of evidence that says those continue. And so that's my addition to number 8. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'll just jump right in there, Barb. So taking my cue from you. So just recalling that I am presenting on the COVID-19 and Indigenous Wellness Report, I just wanted to talk about some of the key recommendations that have come from this report, how this speaks to mental health promotion with children and youth in a broader way, based on principles that are defined in how we as Indigenous people view ourselves in relation to health, as well as our connections that we have with families, communities, things that are more than human, as well as to the land. And I think it's really rooting an understanding of health and wellness in this holistic, broader perspective that has really come through in the stories that are presented in the COVID report. And I think it's from these principles we actually start to see some guideposts and pathways leading us to a better understanding of how to relate with Indigenous people, including children and youth, restoring those family connections, looking at ways that we can continue to reinforce the value of rebuilding what has been a colonial assaulted structure, this family network. It's been an area where Indigenous people have seen the break apart of families, and that has and continues to have an overwhelming impact on mental wellness and mental health. So looking at restoring the balance between that, but then also looking at what we can do to support individuals looking at not just mental health, but also that connection and that balance between physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health. And I think that these are ways that we have seen programs and services respond to the needs of Indigenous people historically, pre-COVID, and certainly has continued to become essential as we look at ways to support Indigenous communities during this time of virus. One point I'd like to draw out of the report, and then I'll make that connection back to the themes, is that our relationships with people and with environments as Indigenous people are key to wellness. Wellness exists in a universe defined by relatedness. So thus, we have not separated the report by subpopulation, but we continue to speak about ourself and our relationships to self, community, land, balance, and self-determination. So if I were to draw connections based on my own observations, and I'm not speaking for anyone else, any of the other authors of the report, when I say this, I would identify the 3 themes, beginning with number 8. So definitely recognizing that there has been an amplification of inequities. Inequities are what birthed this Indigenous health report. We didn't have the data required to present the quote evidence being asked by the Royal Society of Canada. And so we turned to a storytelling methodology because we recognized that, we needed to find ways to take control of collecting, presenting, and determining our own experiences and subsequent directions of what would be required to support Indigenous people pre-post pandemic. The other area that I think is really, I think, a thoughtful addition, and it occurs in the report presented by the Hub, and it also occurs as a reoccurring theme in the Indigenous report, is the unexpected benefits. And so part of mental health promotion and life promotion, mental wellness continuum, is really emphasizing a strengths-based perspective and taking the time to unearth and surface some of the unexpected benefits, the positives, or as the elders in our communities have said, the gifts of the pandemic. We've lived through pandemics before. We come from a place of knowing where Indigenous knowledge systems and our relationship to our ecosystem and our natural environment have equipped us with that knowledge of how to survive, how to thrive during these times. And so I think it's just recognizing that we have that knowledge, we continue to carry it. Our tradition is an oral tradition, and that is how we pass on our values, our lessons, and this type of information. So we still are learning from the knowledge that has been passed on from previous pandemics that have impacted Indigenous people. And so I'll just maybe close out this section with one quick reference, and that is to the cover of the report. So you'll see that here. Gosh, technology, right? I don't actually know how to make it see me, but anyways, the report cover is artistically rendered version, an indigenized version of a COVID cell. So it's actually drawn by artist Lainey Bolio, who's an Indigenous youth and also a future doctor. So she's a Indigenous scholar. And what she wrote is something I just want to share with you in the last few seconds. She said, during COVID-19, I was given the opportunity to live in my home community for 6 months, something I haven't done since leaving home for university. During this time, I was able to reconnect with my family, both human and non-human, and was reminded of what's important to me and what I'm working towards. While I was in my community, I saw all of our vulnerabilities to COVID, like lack of emergency medical transportation, high rates of comorbidity, and our large elder population. But I also saw all the resiliency of my people too, how we all love and look out for one another, something that I had missed desperately during my time in the South. When examining Indigenous health and well-being, it is important to keep both perspectives in mind, our vulnerability and our resiliency, our isolation and our relationality, our past and our future. So I'll just let that rest there. Miigwech.
Colleagues, scholars, your findings and your observations, I think, are so poignant. Others who are listening are thinking heart and head, stories and data, and that COVID is all of those things, and our reactions and interpretations of it involve that. So thank you for what you've offered so far. Many of the themes from the summary paper really resonated one way or another. I'm going to raise up one that I think speaks to some of the COVID experiences in schools. And it's the one that's titled Pandemic Adaptations, an Evolving Process. And one of the reasons I like that actually is I'm really, I like the word evolving. And the reason I like it is because I've actually challenged myself to not say the word pivot anymore. So I don't know if all of you have that same sense, but I'm really tired of that word. So if I say it, you've got to, well, I'm going to try to find other words for it during this talk. The other one, by the way, that our team has decided that we never want to hear again is unprecedented. We are just all longing for precedented times. Like, precedented times are awesome. And so we're hoping for that again. But to say a little bit more about why this particular theme really spoke to me, and must have for all of those who reported in to the hub. On March 12th, we serve alongside the Ministry of Education, but we heard when everyone did that schools were going to close. And it was one day before March break in Ontario, and we knew we had to spring into action. We were thinking about the students, and if you know school systems, you would know that social work and psychology staff would have made safety plans for those students who are feeling most vulnerable for the March break. That March break might now occur for a couple of weeks longer, we thought, at that time, naively. And so we started to think about that. And we pulled together our community of practice and built on some existing tools to kind of put best practice guidance in front of school clinicians for virtual mental health check-ins, knowing that we had to, and as the report said, we're starting to look at online tools. And then as the days progressed, we realized that with this learning at home, educators too were going to need some supports and tools to help them along, to build wellness into classroom learning, because sometimes they were the only ones with eyes on students. You may know that at school, a lot happens in the hallways, a lot happens informally when someone says, "Hey coach, I'd like to talk." So it really became important to have some conversation starters for educators as they were meeting up with students who might be experiencing loss in one way or another, or even grief. And so we leveraged our partnership with the teacher federations and the principal associations in Ontario and directors of education to co-create resources and key messages to draw on. And what we really discovered in that time, and I think one of the key takeaways, is that we actually knew, I think, what we needed to lean on. So there's these moments of feeling overwhelmed during the pandemic or not knowing what to do, and that what I think we discovered along the way is we actually did if we rested on our structures and processes that had served us well so far, and which is what we did. The other part about the report that I liked is people talked about stages they went through as project teams. And I think we too, in the work that we're doing day to day, started to divide it into phases, at least I did in my mind. So that was phase one, that sort of school closure from March to June. And then we very quickly moved into our phase two, which was knowing, by that point that we had summer to then get ready for a very different welcome back to school. And so at that time, we did quite a lot of training with our mental health professionals, recognizing this is a multi-tiered system of support, that we're not just promotion, but prevention and early intervention, and ensuring that they had some tools they could use for students who might have emerging or escalating mental health problems. But at the same time, thinking about what will educators need? What will school leaders need? What will directors of education need? Knowing they've worked full out all summer. And so we put together a return to superintendents that I mentioned. I'm seeing I'm a little unstable, so I'm going to go stop my video. Phase three really was that return to school. And I think what we thought it was going to be is not how it was. And it might be different for where you are, but we found it very uneven. And maybe, Josh, your findings are sort of reflective of that as well. We also found that people appreciated the return to school toolkit we offered, but right in the thick of it, they didn't want resources or tools or templates. What they really wanted was a listening ear, compassion, and in the moment guidance, because things were shifting so quickly. So the role of implementation coaches was really huge, being alongside, walking alongside. And now we're in phase four, which in my brain, I'm calling pandemic winter. You can call it what you like, but it's sort of this coalescing of risks that's required a really big preventive response. we're aware now that it is January in the middle of a pandemic, and at least in Ontario, and I'm sure it's some version of this where you are, there are people learning at home. And I think, Josh, your findings are the first I've seen that really look at the online learning. And I think that might be something we try to unpack a little bit in our next round. But that's very significant, that finding that learners are struggling at home. So we were asked by the Ministry of Education Room Ready that was going to help students with their own wellness right now, learning in classrooms, so learning skills and tools, not just tools, sorry, strategies they could use in the moment to respond, something about their own mental health learning, and something about help seeking. And so we put together a student mental health action kit and we put it on our website. And by the way, we did it in 4 days. But the reason we did it in 4 days is because it was needed, but also we had the resources already. So sort of back to that idea about nothing's net new right now. We're repurposing what we have. We're co-creating with people who are doing the work day to day. And the last point I'll make about it is classroom ready was important. Again, people don't have time to unpack. Our educators, our parents, everyone is really feeling it right now and stressed. And so we wanted to make things that are very user friendly. So we have, for example, virtual field trips where we have folks coming into classrooms and demonstrating the use of particular wellness strategies like calm breathing techniques or that sort of thing. And so the teacher, it's sort of a plug and play. There's a minds-on activity and then there's using the tool. So we're doing our best again to walk alongside. So all that to say that your project story is different than ours, but I think the takeaway is that thinking in phases or stages is helpful. It helps us to kind of make sense of how we can contribute. And that while we had to sidestep or bob and weave or whatever non-pivot word you want to use, we didn't start over. We built on what we had, a provincial strategy that we haven't strayed from, organizational structures and processes that support good implementation, existing tools and resources, and probably most importantly, the foundation of good relationships and co-design that allowed us to face challenges together with the folks that we're trying to serve. So I expect that no matter where you are, those takeaways might sound more or less familiar, even if schools is not the setting that you work in. Thanks.
So many of these words and messages and where they come from, they just really need to land with us, and will take some absorption time. There's no question about that. And I have to say, just very briefly before, I'd like the final round with each of you just to be a kind of that moment of pause and thinking to the future. Right before we get there, I just want to name the very real and very dynamic tensions that we've heard so far in this conversation. We haven't heard that one. Gifts and the grief, past and future, isolation and connectedness, stories and data, just so much that's living side by side. And even our openness and willingness to hold all of those tensions in awareness and deal with them. I've just heard that in spades here. Instead of rushing through different rounds, what I'd like to do is actually move us into a final round with each of the panelists. We will work in a different order this time. Vanessa, then Claire, then Kathy, then Josh. And the invitation in this final round is that looking forward, one final thought on the pandemic context for child and youth mental health promotion that has an emphasis on where to from here. What are some of those actions? What else do we need to learn about to inform the way forward? Vanessa, we'll start with you.
Miigwech, I have lots to say on this, but I will keep it as brief as I can. The point I'd like to emphasize is that Indigenous self-determination, leadership, and place-based knowledge have successfully protected Indigenous communities in Canada through this time of COVID. We've seen a lot of communities that have shut down access from outsiders. And while we might see spikes in data in some places, we have seen many communities who we would consider to be quite vulnerable successfully having 0 cases. So there is some hope in the ways that Indigenous people, at least in First Nation and rural communities, have been able to shut down and use their own governance structures and leadership to enact those self-determined practices. And because of that, these principles should be at the forefront when planning for public health, policy, and action with Indigenous people. Strategies for healing and wellness must encompass social, spiritual, and land-based relationships. And the youth have said it over and over, and they're leading by example. Just go out in the land. On the land, there is purpose, hope, and belonging. And I think we all intrinsically know that. And that is something that connects us in our essential humanness. And I'll finish with a quote from the story that I authored in the book. The virus is here to wake up the world. Too many people are not connected to the land and water. It's time for people to pay attention, to be still, and to reevaluate our lives. It's time for us to be connected to our own way of being in the world and to get in touch with our own spirit and self. Miigwech.
Wow, thank you, Vanessa. That was beautiful and hard to follow. So I'm going to go back to our findings. And there were 4 specific things that sort of rose out of those 5 webinars. But before I go there, Kathy, one of the basic emergency preparedness principles is to scale up what you already do, not to change sort of in the middle of an emergency. So I think there was some tremendous wisdom in what you chose to do within your organization, is scale up, intensify what you know to be true and how you work. So I think those are good principles to look at on the way forward. What we heard is to apply a whole of community approach and to engage individuals, families, community members, organizations in all planning response. And I think from an emergency preparedness, and I'm finding myself speaking from that space, so that's interesting. But from an emergency preparedness perspective, not to forget about recovery. There is recovery going on right now, and there will be recovery going on for a very long time. And not to, when we're all immunized and this thing has gone away, to really make it keep surfacing, right? What is that recovery? Because if we are going to go back to better, then what is that better? And what is the recovery process that we all are part of and all have a responsibility in? And to really make sure that we engage communities, that we engage youth and children. And I would agree, Vanessa, they've got some incredible ideas about what that recovery and what that better is. And going back to the land and being in natural environments is certainly part of that. Making sure that we work across sectors, so not just in health, but health and social sectors, business sectors, economic sectors, so that we can actually design a just or a fair and a sustainable future on the way forward. Acting with partners across sectors to really call out, if you will, and disrupt oppressive systems. We know they exist, and it takes courage to speak to them. And I think, Barb, that binary that you are, this and that, we see it. Don't be complicit in it. Speak to it. We have privilege, we have power. Speak to it, name it, call it out, and disrupt oppressive systems, because we really do need to invest in healthy communities if we're going to have a sustainable future. And then I think all of us have an opportunity to really, and I think it is through narrative and stories and stories of solutions and stories of strength, make sure that we keep bringing up those messages that are going to keep those equity issues and their solutions in that public consciousness, because they're there now. So there is a bit of an opening for that. And I actually think that youth can do that really effectively as well, not to burden them and put all that responsibility on them. But I think lifting their stories and giving them that opportunity for voice, I think will be make a difference on the way forward. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
It's interesting because I had two things that I thought I would feature, and one is exactly as you said, well, many were exactly as you just said, Claire, but I think tuning into youth voice and providing space and platform is a really critical thing. Young people have a role and they have so much to say in this space, and so many tremendous ideas, but it's not a matter of paving the way for them or you know, standing back. It's about walking beside and standing beside, because this work is hard work and it can't be done alone. The last note I would say is share the good. It's important to acknowledge the strain, the distress, the discomfort, the very real loss that's happened. But at the same time, I think we need to find and celebrate what's good and lovely and heroic. There are many everyday heroes in the COVID story, and I think we need to change the discourse from mental illness to mental health. They're different things, as you all know, and I think we really need to shine a spotlight on that. So I'll leave the last words to Josh, and lots of space for, I know, your good words.
Thank you, Kathy. I really wish we had more time. I have so much to say about what Claire and Vanessa and Kathy have shared. It just really affirms the work we're doing, and it really resonates strongly with me, and I know it would with the rest of our team. It's so gratifying to hear. So selfishly, I wish we had more time. But I would like to end on a note of hope. Hope by itself is not a strategy, as we know. It's not a plan. But there is hope in the work we do. And we know, and the other panelists have spoken to this, they've touched on it. So we know from our findings that social responsibility and empathy are up. So over a third of kids say their levels of empathy are higher than pre-pandemic, and more than a quarter say that their sense of social responsibility is higher. So their pandemic is making them reflect more deeply on the role they can play in society, and also what is happening to others. So I think this is an incredible moment where we as adults can sort of move those structures and those forces that act on children inequitably and step aside and let them take on a leadership role to sort of get us out of this degraded era that we live in. And that is what I'm really hopeful about in the work that we're doing, that looking forward to a time when this group, you know, I think about the kids out there across the country whose empathy is turned up to 11, whose sense of justice now, when they see everything around them, is turned up to 11. Imagine what they can do. And it's not about empowering youth. I don't think that's the right language. It's about, as the others have said, walking alongside and making sure those structures and systems do not get in the way of the incredible work that they can do in the future.
There's such a big part of me that doesn't want to say anything more. You've punctuated that so beautifully, but you know, it's I do want to extend a huge thank you, of course. Perhaps before doing so, I mean, it's each of you explicitly or implicitly have talked about, I wish we had more time, and you know, we can carry this conversation on for a long time. And there may be opportunities to do that. Kathy, you mentioned, you know, evolving, that's one of the notions that you're really connected to. And as conditions evolve, as our circumstances evolve, conversations need to evolve. And perhaps one of the things we can do is create those forums for more of these conversations as it makes sense. I do want to thank first the Mental Health Promotion Innovation Fund projects for sharing your pandemic stories. They really provided the anchor for the discussion here today. And of course, sincere thanks to all of the panel members and the teams you work with that, have allowed you to, come here today and share your data, your experiences. But, I think what strikes me the most is, there are data, there are experiences. What we've heard in today's session is a lot of heart. And yes, I talked about many of the dynamic tensions that sort of emerged in the conversation. I think, if I had to perhaps name the overall dichotomy and dynamic tension, it would be the heartbreaking and the heartwarming from the COVID experience. And I think we've heard that in spades through what has been shared today and in the MHPIF project stories. So I will, with a few sort of closing remarks and capping off, bringing some loose fastening. I never talk about closure anymore. Kathy, you don't say pivot. I don't say closure. We loosely fasten, and then create a bit of a preview for tomorrow. But I will I'll circle back to the theme of hope. So in terms of what we did today, yes, we explored the international, the Canadian, our own context for child and youth mental health promotion, and we explored the pandemic context as well. And for what's up tomorrow, our third and final day, we will move into, and these topics, the first topic in particular has really been signaled in a couple of the sessions today, a context-sensitive approach to scaling up. What does that mean? Where do we take that? We will also have an opportunity to shape some of the hub supports for over the next year and have a brief ceremony to conclude the symposium. So the sessions on scaling up are 3A and 3B. 3A is on your own time. That's our second asynchronous session. Please view the pre-recorded presentation on context-sensitive scaling by Mark Cabage, and you won't be disappointed, I promise. You'll find the presentation on Whova, session 3A, and it's also now posted in the chat if you'd like to copy and paste it from there. 3B is another exceptional panel tomorrow. 3C takes us into another interactive exercise to have your voice heard about how we might move forward together as a mix of communities over the year ahead. And then, as I say, we'll conclude with a ceremony 3D. So between now and tomorrow, you can expect an end of day 2 email from the hub, just like last evening. It will remind you of preparation for tomorrow. Before you sign off, I ask you to please head to the Whova polls once again. You know the drill: agenda in the left navigation pane, find the current session and click on the polls on the right-hand top panel. One extra special reason for doing this is not that it'll just keep Annetta happy, but an extra special reason is that tomorrow we'll be able to, there's one extra question that we'll be able to share a word cloud that captures a little bit of a temperature check on your experience of the event so far. So if you're so inclined, we do invite and encourage you to head to the polls. And I promised just a moment ago that I would return to the theme of hope before closing. And to fasten this session and day 2 of the symposium, I do invite you to watch the video that will be posted. Is it there yet? Yep. Yes, it is now. Video that's posted in the Zoom chat. It's called Good Job, and with thanks to Kathy Short for bringing this to our attention and for the suggestion. Once you click the link, you will actually be able to leave the meeting and continue watching the video. And that video will just so nicely punctuate some of the themes from this session and the day. So we do look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.